Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be ranking every single episode from Season 1 of MLP from Trip is Magic, and this is sort of a new stage in this series I've been putting together, where obviously I've been very interested in reviewing certain episodes of the show and doing these theme-based videos or character-based videos where I only rank certain episodes that fit those themes or are focus episodes for those specific characters. However, now that I kind of went through some themes that I want to do, I kind of want to get a bit bigger now. And obviously, the next big step for that is to do the seasons. And eventually, I do want to make a big video or couple videos that rank every single episode of the show. But for now, I do want to go through each season and do my own in season episode rankings. So, like I said, I'll be doing this for season 1 today. However, down the line, I will be doing them for the other seasons of the show and then eventually working in that bigger project. So, yeah, there are 25 episodes to rank. I will be counting the two-parter from the season as one episode, as I usually do. And let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off the list at number 25, and really these bottom couple of episodes are pretty bad. I wouldn't call them the very worst of the series. However, they're also not particularly great. And I did, debate a little bit. However, I feel like there's a clear bottom answer for me. So at number 25, the worst episode from season 1 for me is Als Well That Ends Well. And I did talk about this one already in my Spike episode ranking. Okay, so if you want to hear my more complete thoughts on that episode, go check out that video. But this episode is just not fun to watch at all. I mean, basically, the episode's supposed to have us believe that Spike is in the wrong here for wanting to feel like he's useful and that he's Twilight's #1 assistant. Obviously, with Owlicious coming to the picture, he really wants to paint Owlicious in a bad light, only for everything to backfire and for Twilight to just get more mad at him. And I think a big problem with this episode is Twilight and the fact that she doesn't realize just how much this whole situation is upsetting him. Now, again, they do address it to a degree where she's like, oh, well, Owlicious is only helping me with stuff at night. But then we literally see Owlicious doing stuff during the day, which again just makes Spike feel worse. And obviously, Spike only continues to try to make Owlicious seem bad so that Twilight will get rid of him or her, I guess. And then obviously by the end, Twilight gets so mad at him that she says, I'm very disappointed in you, which, given the fact that this whole episode is framed around Spike believing that he's Twilight's #1 assistant, obviously that is a big chink in his armor. And I also talked about this in the other video, but just in general, I don't like the whole dynamic of Spike being Twilight's assistant. I much rather prefer episodes in which he is presented as either her brother or her friend or her son. This is just not very fun at all. And it's a big reason I have this here at number 25. Now moving on to number 24, and we are finally talking about an episode that I haven't had a chance to discuss on this channel yet, but it's still a pretty bad episode in my opinion. But here we have Look Before You Sleep. And I think this is a pretty notably bad episode, although one that tends to get forgotten about nowadays. But I feel like similar to Als Well That Ends Well, this episode's main problem is with Twilight. Now, admittedly, I think there is a bit of a charm to seeing her being so naive when it comes to her throwing a slumber party, with her getting very excited about throwing a slumber party. The fact that she needs a book to help her figure out how to throw one is pretty endearing. However, it's also a double-edged sword in that it makes her completely naive to this entire conflict that's happening. Where it'd be one thing if, the episode presented it as Applejack and Rarity are just under the same roof because they have nowhere else to go because of the storm, which is true in that that's the reason that they are over at Twilight's house to begin with. But the fact that Twilight is just so clueless to all the bitterness that's happening between these two characters, which, to be fair, I mean, that is a fair conflict to have this early in the series. Now, I guess you could debate some of the early episodes before that, showing them getting along. But obviously, you can tell that before this, the series, that these two characters would not have really spent that much time together, except now they really have to deal with their differences. like in terms of Applejack being more willing to get dirty, being more of a roughhouser, while Rarity is more dainty and is more work concerned about remaining clean and stuff. So obviously they had to deal with that. And the fact that Twilight is not only clueless to this, but gets so selfish at the same time where, yes, like I said, there is an endearing quality to her being so giddy and naive. But at the end of the day, like, it ultimately clouds her judgment and makes it so that she gets mad at Applejack and Rarity for continuing to fight, even though she's made no effort to really address the conflict at all. She's just been trying to have this slumber party only for them to get in the way, for them to channel their frustration at each other. And then obviously we have that scene where she finally snaps at them and she's like, "You've ruined my very first slumber party," as if this entire conflict was entirely about you, which isn't great at the end of the day. And plus, yeah, it is your pretty generic message about how they have to get along. And they do kind of work together towards the end. But it's the fact that Twilight spent so much of the episode just being clueless to all this and just allowing the conflict to happen, not really doing anything to address it, and then trying to essentially guilt them at the end by making it all about her saying that they ruined her sleepover when it was clear that they didn't want to spend time with each other to begin with. That just isn't great. And aside from that, I mean, there are some fun gags, I guess, but at the end of the day, like the fact that like Applejack and Rarity keep fighting, the fact that Twilight doesn't seem to know what's going on, those are some pretty big knocks for me. Doesn't really make it enjoyable for that much. And because of that, this episode's here at number 24. Now we're moving on to number 23. And again, we are talking about a new episode, one that I haven't already discussed. And here we have Ghostbusters. And Ghostbusters is interesting because it is an episode that I know historically isn't that well received. And I didn't enjoy it per se, but I just kind of felt it was whatever for the longest time. Didn't really care that much for it. But I think after reflecting on it some more, I mean, there are some more flaws with it than I gave it credit for. Because for the longest time, I just felt it was kind of boring. Like, yeah, it's your typical message about not being a showboat and whatever. Like Twilight, like doesn't want to be a showboat. Like saves the day at the end, only to immediately regret her actions, thinks that's a showboaty thing, when in reality, everyone just praises her for saving the town. So that's something at least. But I think as time has gone on, I have become more aware of the flaws, which is a big reason I have it this low on the list. Because when you really think about it, Trixie doesn't do that much wrong to be villainized like this. I mean, yeah, she is cocky. I mean, yeah, she is a bit of a showboat. But at the end of the day, I mean, she is a performer. Like, she is trying to make a living. And yeah, you can sort of falter a bit because a lot of her magic is just simple magic tricks, which in a world where you have unicorns and magic already, I mean, what use is there for a magician? So I felt like that was at least a pro for the episode, but also contributes to it not being that enjoyable because we see the rest of the main six get really self-righteous when it comes to knocking down Trixie to really teach her a lesson about humility. And a lot of this, the more I think about it, just screams of Mysterious Marriage Well, which obviously is a season 2 episode. We'll be talking about that more in the season 2 video. But it is a similar problem at the end of the day where Trixie, again, Trixie, yeah, is arrogant. Yeah, she's probably doing stuff that shouldn't be that impressive. But still, I mean, she doesn't actively go out of her way to make the main six lives terrible. If anything, the main six kind of provoke her and really try to villainize her. That causes her to sort of become this villain. So, and I feel like that is a big issue with the episode. Also, the fact that this episode just isn't that funny at the end of the day. Like, when your main joke in the episode is Spike trying to grow a mustache, I mean, that kind of says something about the level of comedy we're dealing with here. And of course, we have the ending where, like Snips and Sales, they are so impressed by Trixie that they literally lure a Ursa Minor to the town, like which wreaks havoc. And again, Trixie is supposed to be in the wrong for this for some reason, even though it was entirely Snips and Snails that did it. But the episode wants us to believe that Trixie was so cocky and made everyone believe she was so amazing at magic that it inspired Snips and Snails to attract the Ursa Minor, thinking that Trixie would be able to stop it, when in reality, Trixie was just in over her head. But still, I mean, again, sort of weird way to villainize Trixie, which sort of realistic, but again, like Trixie doesn't do that much to actively bring this upon herself. It's more so other circumstances demanding that she be brought down to earth, which isn't fun the more that I think about it. So, yes, the more I think about this episode is genuinely bad. And yes, while the message isn't that bad, while Twilight is somewhat like relatable in the sense that she doesn't want to be a showboat and even thinks the act of saving the town is in in effect showing off her abilities in an unfavoring way. It's just the fact that there's so much self-righteousness going on. The fact that Tracy isn't even that evil yet gets completely villainized in this episode is a big reason that I have it this low, and it's here at number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22, and we are back talking about an episode I previously talked about. Mind you, it is a bit lower than I was expecting it to be coming into this list, but whatever. And here we have the Showstoppers. And I already talked about this one in my CMC episode ranking. Mind you, it wasn't that low on that list. However, it was still the lowest ranked season 1 episode. And I guess considering the fact that it wasn't super duper low on the CMC ranking, that I was expecting it to be a little higher on this list. But after just thinking about it more and more, like I just couldn't really justify it. Now, as I said in that previous video, I don't hate this episode as much as a lot of other people do. I mean, I feel like the song, yes, while bad, isn't the worst thing in the world. And I do think there is something to be had there with the CMC trying out different things in an effort to like try to figure things out, only at the end of the episode for it to not come out. And I know people criticize this episode because it should have been very obvious what the CMC skills actually were. They just were doing the wrong thing, but whatever. However, I guess the main reason that I still have this episode relatively low here is I guess some of it is due to the mean-spiritedness of it, like the fact that they literally win the award for best comedy when they weren't trying to win the best comedy award. That's not particularly great. And aside from that, like the fact that the CMC don't really learn that much. I mean, I guess that's something at least, again, you need to justify it somehow, but it still feels very rough in terms of what the CMC are, in terms of their dynamic. You can tell that this was written at a time when they still thought that maybe there was a shot that the CMC could have gotten their own spinoff, which, again, the fact that we didn't get that may have been for the better, the more that I think about it. But again, I still don't think this episode is particularly great, and that's a big reason why it's this low. However, it's not the worst episode in the world, and I guess you could argue that it could be a couple spots higher considering the episodes we'll be talking about shortly. However, at the end of the day, it's just kind of there. Like, while I don't hate it that much, there also isn't that much overly impressive about it, which is a big reason that I have it here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and I feel like the next couple episodes we'll be discussing are all ones where the main issue seems to be the message of the episode. And while I have various levels of complaints with the message, whether in content or in execution, I feel like they are still in this relative tier. But at number 21, we have Over a Barrel. And I know a lot of people have criticized this episode for its handling of its metaphor concerning Native Americans and Western settlers. And admittedly, I don't think it handles it that great, where it is trying to take a both sides have a point sort of issue, which I mean, I could live with. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's also not something that I particularly find handled well here. And aside from that, I just found this episode kind of boring, if I'm being perfectly honest. Like, while I don't think it's the worst episode in the world, it's also not one that I revisit that often. And I still think some of the complaints there are valid, where I don't think the message, they definitely try to do a more complex message, but it's not just handled in the best way, which is a big reason that I don't have this episode too high, and it's here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and we have a sort of similar episode where the message isn't as controversial and arguably could be done well. However, I feel like the execution is completely off. But here at number 20, we have Swarm of the Century. And the thing for me about this episode is similar to Over a Barrel. It's not an episode that I revisit too often. It's not very interesting to me. I found it kind of boring at points. And it does have an okay message of how you shouldn't dismiss people, how you should listen to people, which honestly, I mean, if you know me, I'm not a huge fan of miscommunications. I mean, while they are part of life and while they are happening more often than we like to admit, they are also a very frustrating plot device. It's something where it leads to a very frustrating experience in the sense that you're just waiting for the moment where everything blows up or the moment where the characters just open their mouths and start talking. And this is a pretty prime example of this, where obviously we have Pinky who has the solution to the problem, and we obviously see her do stuff to try and solve that. However, she never makes any effort to explain herself at any point, where obviously the main focus of the episode is on the rest of the main six and how their issues is not asking Pinky what to do or what she's doing or how they can help. I feel like the bigger issue is the fact that Pinky never explains herself, even when others try to ask. Like, she just is like, I'm getting these musical instruments now, or look, I have this musical instrument, and then proceeds to make everything worse, mainly because the others were interfering, which, I mean, isn't great. It's just more so the fact that Pinky never opens her mouth at any point, and obviously by the end, while the rest of the main six are supposed to learn the lesson of like listening to her friends, like the fact that Pinky never makes any effort to explain herself or try to get the others involved is a big knock for me, and probably what makes this episode pretty frustrating to watch. Where I feel like instead of the issue being rest of the main six not listening, it's more so the fact that Pinky never opens her mouth, which is an issue on its own, and definitely something that makes the episode worse for me, and a big reason I have this episode here at number 20. Now we're moving on to number 19, and I know people are not going to like this, as I'm sure a lot of people are expecting this episode to be at the very bottom of the list. And to be fair, there was a point where I did consider putting it lower than it is now. However, after thinking about some more, I figured it wasn't that bad. And here we have Feeling Pinky Keen. Now, the thing about this episode is it's kind of similar to Over a Barrel, where it has the issue of its message and how there are issues with its execution. And obviously, a lot of people talk about how this is the worst message of season one, if not one of the worst messages in the entire series. I mean, most people know that. And obviously, it made me stop to question whether it was bad. Because on the surface, yeah, I mean, the episode is about Twilight learning to accept the Pinky sense as what it is versus trying to understand how it works, per se. But honestly, after thinking about some more, I don't think it's the worst message in the world, or at least not the worst idea in the world. Because I understand the idea that there are some things that we just don't understand that honestly we don't necessarily need to understand. Like in Twilight's case, I mean, does it really make her life any better if she knows the ins and outs of the Pinky sense? I mean, maybe for the purposes of predicting the future, I guess, but generally no. I mean, I know that isn't a popular thing to say, and I'm not arguing we should accept faith over reason, as some people have interpreted this episode to be about. But in reality, I think people accept that they don't know everything and they don't care enough to learn about certain things because it simply isn't relevant to their everyday lives. I mean, I think what people want more than reason itself is a reason to care about the reason. So I'm not saying this that the intended message is dead on arrival, but I mean, that doesn't make the episode good or anything. I still think by the end it falls into the faith over reason pitfalls, like Twilight choosing to wear an umbrella at the end and trying to apply warnings in her life. And again, I can see people interpreting this episode as being anti science. However, the reason I don't fault this episode all the way is that I feel like if this episode had been retooled better, it could have been very interesting. Like with Over a Barrel, I feel like no matter what, that episode would have been controversial regardless, and probably not that interesting to watch. Whereas Feeling Pinky Keen, I mean, I think there is a decent message there. The problem is the execution, and obviously it just doesn't do it necessarily well. Plus, the episode itself isn't that funny. So I think that causes this episode to be at the bottom of the list. And I know there are people who think this episode should be even lower than that. However, it's the fact that I don't completely disagree with what they were going for. And I could see them attempting to do something interesting with this sort of message that leads me to put it here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and I feel like we're now entering a new tier on the list of episodes that aren't the worst in the world, but are also kind of boring, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I feel like this episode kind of fits into this, but here we have Bridal Gossip. And similar to Feeling Pinky Keen, I did have a debate over this one, as similar to that episode, this episode isn't that well remembered. I know there are people who complain a lot about this message, and to be fair, I don't necessarily like this episode either. However, I don't have that many issues with the actual message itself. I mean, it's a standard racism is bad story and don't judge a book by its cover. And honestly, I don't have too many issues with it. Like, I guess you could fault Sakura for like not realizing how she's coming off to people, but to be fair, they do justify it pretty well by saying that she's from a far off land and that she obviously isn't as familiar with a lot of the customs, maybe partly because like she hasn't really talked to anyone that lives in Ponyville. So I don't have too many issues with the actual message of the episode. And even like some of the other complaints, like the fact that Apple Bloom leaves Applejack for dead, supposedly speaking, like again, I don't have that many issues with it either. I mean, the Everfree Force in this episode at least isn't presented as that dangerous. I mean, so there's that at least. My main issue with the episode is it's just really boring. Like, I know people love the evil Enchantress strong or find it so bad it's good, but to me, it's just whatever. And really, the rest of the poison joke gags aren't that great either. Like, Applejack is small, Fluttershy has a deep voice, I guess. Uh, Twilight has polka dots on her horn. You know, like Rainbow Dash can fly backwards. Like, okay, like I don't really care that much about it. And I guess the other issue with the episode is that similar to Swarm of the Century, I feel like there are some miscommunication issues. I mean, again, not as bad as what we had in that episode, but still, it still did contribute a bit to some of my enjoyment of that episode. So at the end of the day, I mean, this episode's just kind of okay. I mean, it's not as bad as people say it is, but it's also not that great either. And I have it here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we have another episode that I already talked about in a previous video. And here we have Stairmaster, which, similar to Bridal Gossip, it's just okay. Admittedly, the message isn't as profound as Bridal Gossip is, and I feel like at the end of the day, there isn't that much going for it outside, I guess, the songs. But I mean, it's your typical CMC episode again. You know, like they're still very in their rough form. Like they just cause a lot of trouble. They are very rambunctious. You can tell that they were still trying to make a spinoff with all this. But I mean, this episode is just largely inoffensive in my opinion. I mean, it has your message of Fluttershy being more assertive, or at least learning to use her stare in a more strategic manner outside of just using it for animals. Yeah, the cockatrice stuff, I mean, okay. And, you know, the CMC aren't that bad in the episode, but they can get a little annoying at points. So because of that, I have this episode here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we have another episode that I already talked about in a previous video. And here we have Ticketmaster. And yes, this is a very early episode, the first regular 22-minute episode in this series. And it is very unremarkable, in my opinion. I mean, yes, you have the songs that Pinky sings. You have each of the main six like giving their own reasons for why they should go to the gala. Obviously, there are issues with the premise in the sense that Celestia only gave Twilight 2 tickets when she knows that she has 6 friends, or 5, I guess. And obviously, a lot of the episode is Twilight really struggling to come up with this decision, while the rest of the main six pretty much do everything in their power to get their tickets for themselves. Although, to be fair, I can justify to a degree in the sense that maybe this was just Celestia's friendship lesson by deliberately only giving her 2 tickets and just hoping that Twilight would come around to ask her for more. But even still, it's sort of a weird message at the end of the day, because for all Celestia knew, I mean, Twilight could have quickly figured out, oh, there are only 2 tickets, I should ask for more. Or, I don't know, maybe Celestia was taking advantage of her status, you know, like knowing that maybe Twilight would have been too scared to ask her for more, thinking that was already an honor enough to be given the 2. So, I don't know. I mean, the premise is just kind of whatever. And aside from that, a lot of the episodes just kind of boring. Like a lot of it's just waiting for Twilight to crack and to say that she doesn't want to disappoint any of them, which is a little relatable, but also we have to deal with a lot of the main six, giving them different reasons for the tickets. And obviously, that scene where Pinky has that whole parade, lets the whole town know about the gala and gets them involved as well. So, whatever. I mean, this episode has some minor stuff going for it, but it's not my favorite in the world. And it's here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15. And we have another episode that I'm sure a lot of people were expecting to be very low on the list. However, the more I think about it, there just aren't that many issues with it, if I'm being honest. But here we have A Bird in the Hoof. Now, this episode does have a similar issue to Ticketmaster in that you can question the premise a bit, where obviously a lot of it centered around Fluttershy stealing Philomena, thinking that Philomena is sick and Celestia is a bad caretaker, where obviously this whole conflict could have been resolved if Fluttershy had just opened her mouth. Then again, there are similar issues to Ticketmaster in that, like, maybe like the ponies are scared to talk to Celestia given her status. But to be fair, this episode is like you would rather steal Philomena and just hope to not get caught versus just talking to her. So I don't know. I found that a bit wonky. And again, this episode at the end of the day isn't too remarkable either. However, I will give it some more credit than Ticketmaster in a few regards. For one, I feel like it was more entertaining. Like the entire party scene at the beginning where everyone is just walking on eggshells trying to appease Celestia, when we see from early on that Celestia is just very relaxed. Like she is a bit of a jokester. Like when Mrs. Cake is keep stirring her tea, and like Celestia like pretends to take a sip at one point, and then Mrs. Cake pours it only for it to overflow. So like we see from early on that she has a sense of humor. Obviously, the scene where Pinky eats Celestia's cupcake, and she's like, "Oh, you're gonna eat that," and then just a delayed response between her eating it, chewing it up, and then cuts to Mrs. Cake freaking out. I mean, I know I haven't talked as much about this in this video specifically, but one of the things I like about season one is like its awkward humor. I mean, unintentionally, of course. I mean, because like the animation, the pacing, it just isn't there, but there's a lot of like really strange moments that happen because like there's like lags. And that's just one of the moments that really sticks out to me. There's obviously the entire scene where Twilight is trying to scare Fluttershy by being like, "Oh, well, if she catches you, she's gonna put you into a cage in inside a dungeon inside a whale's belly or something like that." So stuff like that. I mean, the ending is something at least. So at the end of the day, I mean, this episode isn't great, but there are a few glimmering aspects to it, and again, I'm just not that mad at this episode compared to a lot of other people. And I feel like compared to even other episodes that people say is one of the worst, this episode just even more so is just not an episode that I particularly see the issues with or care much about the issues with, which is a big reason that I have it here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we're continuing with these average episodes for me. And here we have Fall Weather Friends. And this episode is all right. I mean, it's sort of lighthearted in the sense that, we see Rainbow Dash and Applejack have their rivalry of them just competing in a bunch of these games. Mind you, it's a little ridiculous with the crowd that they attract and how everyone seems to be taking this so seriously when it could have very easily just been the two of them plus the main six watching them play these games and stuff. Mind you, the actual running the leaves is a bit weird of a world building trick. I mean, we'll definitely talk about that in a bit, but obviously, I mean, it is some world building at least. I mean, I do question the purpose of it. Really, I question the purpose of seasons in general within MLP, but that's neither here nor there. Like the actual race itself is okay. I mean, it kind of has this rabbit in the tortoise moral of slow and steady wins the race. Or at least Twilight says that she was pacing herself and then just sprinted at the end. So even then, not exactly tortoise and hare story there. But even then, the main conflict there is Applejack and Rainbow Dash continuing to undermine each other, just continuing to throw each other under the bus until they both end up losing. And through that, they learn a lesson about like friendly competition and stuff, just having fun. fine message, like a little boring at points, but like not the worst episode in the world. Has some minor, like light-hearted stuff here and there that does keep it above certain other episodes we talked about earlier, and it's here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13. We have a somewhat similar episode. I mean, not my favorite in the world, and definitely has some slow points, but it is a bit more interesting than Fall Weather Friends. And here we have a dog and pony show. And obviously, the main selling point of this episode is the fact that Rarity is supposed to be this damsel in distress, but ends up annoying the Diamond Dog so much that they end up letting her go. And, there are some fun moments with that. I mean, obviously, they mean this as a way of being subversive. And there are some funny gags, like particularly when Rarity starts crying, like when like she complains about the shackle that she's in. So there's that. At least there is a bit of catharsis with seeing Rarity being empowered. But for the most part, this is just kind of a normal episode. I mean, I don't really care that much for the Diamond Dogs. And the fact that they never really play that big of a role in the show again thereafter is kind of whatever. So there's that. There's also the fantasy sequence Spike has where he's fighting them all off. Again, showing off some of that season one awkwardness there. So there's that at least. There are definitely some highlights of this episode and definitely things that I enjoy about it, but it's still not my favorite, and it's here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and to be honest, I didn't know what to do with this episode per se, because on one hand, it is sort of in line with a lot of these other episodes I talked about, where it's not that interesting at the end of the day. However, I think there is a bit more going on with it, and here we have Apple Buck season. And I could see some people saying this one's too high. I mean, it's definitely not the most interesting episode in the world, and I could see some minor complaints with it, but honestly, it's not that bad. I mean, the message itself is pretty standard where, it's about asking for help when you need it. But I think it goes a bit further than that in really highlighting some of the real world consequences of Applejack's decisions, where not only does her, like, not asking for help and doing everything on her own harm herself, in the sense that, like she's tired all the time, she can't really do the things that she does well, but also the fact that it harms others in the fact that she is overextended in doing these other things. She has responsibilities outside of that, and the fact that she doesn't ask for help results in her messing up other things, which in turns causes harm, like her like putting the wrong ingredients into the muffins she's making with Pinky, which causes a bunch of people to get sick. Also, when she messes up the bunny census, which causes them to destroy a bunch of flowers. I mean, there is stuff like that. Now, I could see some minor complaints in that, like, she doesn't really get called out for it that much. That is a bit of an issue. Also, the fact that ponies don't pick up on the fact that she's tired and she's overworked. But honestly, it's not that bad at the end of the day, and I still think it does a good enough job at communicating the various ways in which Applejack's behavior, again, affects multiple people and across multiple different aspects of things. So I think that's something at least, but at the end of the day, I can't have it that much higher than it. So because of that, I had to leave it here at number 12. Now we're moving on to a bit of a more memorable episode, and here we have Winter Wrap Up. And obviously this episode's fine. I mean, obviously it's best known for the song, which is pretty good. Although the rest of the episode is pretty alright, where Twilight does try to help out only to screw up over and over again. And I do feel bad for her when Applejack yells at her for making the snow situation worse. I mean, the resolution is pretty interesting, where it turns out that all the efforts were disorganized, thus allowing Twilight to step in. However, whether this truly constitutes a middle ground between tradition and modernity is up for debate. But one thing I struggle to understand, and again, I definitely talked about this earlier with Fall Weather Friends. This will not be the last time I mention this. Like, what is even the purpose of winter in Equestria? Like, I know I'm not the first person to mention this, but we literally established in this episode and others that ponies in the society have the ability to control the weather. And through that, it makes me wonder what the purpose of winter even is, especially when we see places like Ponyville struggle so much to wrap it up when it's all over. Now, it does an okay job by having Ponyville reject modern technology for winter wrap up in favor of tradition, but again, it still doesn't really explain why they're okay with letting winter happen in the first place. Especially in this world where winter is associated with the Wendigos, who are fabled to bring about the end of the world. Now, granted, we didn't know that at this point in the series, but again, it's just an overarching problem at the end of the day with the series that is. And while it's not that huge of a problem with this episode, it still makes me wonder. I mean, and again, this isn't going to be the last time I bring this up. This episode's okay. I mean, it does present some interesting stuff with like modernity versus tradition, with obviously modernity kind of winning out, but also them not fully embracing it, where they still do the things that they normally do, except now they have a more systemized way of doing it so that they can do it more efficiently. Also, the ending isn't that great, where again, they literally let Spike fall into the ice water and get sick. That's not great. So, again, this episode's fine. Like I said, it has a good song. It has some wholesome scenes with Twilight in it. I do end up feeling bad for her, and it has a somewhat interesting message, but again, it has some slow points, and obviously the ending is just kind of whatever. That leads me to put it here at number 11. All right, we have now reached the top 10, and while we are still technically in the middle tier, I still think this is a solid enough episode. But on number 10, we have the pilot, Friendship is Magic, and again, this is a fine episode. I mean, it does a good job for what it is of setting up the world, of introducing us to all these characters, introducing the elements of harmony, introducing us to the general theme of the show. And again, it is a pretty small scale, relatively speaking, even though, I mean, Eternal Night should be a pretty disastrous thing with it potentially bringing about the end of the world, but it does a decent enough job of keeping the scope feeling small, as we don't really see the ramifications of Eternal Night, like with the effects that it has on others. It mainly just focuses on the main six and them just going through the Everfree Forest, learning something about each other, and then coming out on top at the end. Now, again, there are some missed opportunities here and there, like learning about Celestia and Luna's relationship, where a lot of it is sort of left to that storybook segment at the beginning and at the very end when Luna is ultimately redeemed. Again, I did talk a bit about that in my previous video. There's also, like some minor stuff like Applejack's family, the fact that she is set up as being part of this very big family, but obviously we don't end up seeing it thereafter. Some minor establishment stuff, experimentation, like Spike being bad at spelling, which is never brought up again. You also have the CMC accidentally meeting each other, which again wasn't intentional, but they left it in the animation anyway. I found that pretty humorous. And obviously, you have probably the scene that sticks to my mind the most, which is the very beginning when Twilight turns down Moon Dancer's party. Again, pretty iconic scene for me at this point. So, like, there is plenty of fun stuff in this episode, and for what it is a pilot. It is introducing us to the world. It does a pretty good job there. But there are some minor issues with the story. Again, I already talked about in my two-parter ranking. Like, why couldn't Applejack just explain why Twilight should let go when she barely knows her? Like, there's stuff like that. Again, some minor stuff here and there, but for the most part, this is a fine episode, a fine introduction to the series, and I have it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we are wrapping up the middle tier at this point, and here we have Green Isn't Your Color. And I think there's plenty of good stuff about this episode, particularly the fact that Rarity and Fluttershy have different perspectives when it comes to Fluttershy's fame. And obviously, they don't really want to tell each other the truth because they feel like the other would feel hurt by it. Obviously, we see Rarity not wanting to tell Fluttershy that she's jealous because she feels like it would hurt Fluttershy's feelings. And we have Fluttershy not wanting to tell Rarity that she doesn't want all this fame because she feels like it gives Rarity a sense of validation. And of course, we have Twilight like knowing both perspectives but can't really say anything because, well, okay, I'm just going to say it. The main issue I have with this episode is that Pinkie kind of perpetuates the conflict for seemingly no reason, where, I mean, yes, we get introduced to the Pinkie promise in this episode and we see her really uphold it, but I feel like it also allows the conflict to go on for as long as it does. And considering I've already talked plenty about miscommunications on this list, I mean, it's not particularly ideal that someone is literally preventing someone from telling other characters information that would probably resolve the conflict. So I don't think that's particularly ideal. But honestly, it's not a massive knock at the end of the day. I mean, it's still a very enjoyable episode. And plus, even without Pinky, I mean, each of the characters still have enough of a reason to not tell each other for pretty good reasons, if you ask me. So I feel like that at least makes up for it to a degree. And plus, there's pretty solid moments in this episode as well, like when Fluttershy misses Rarity's date and she gets very upset and tries screaming. So there's that. And even like the fashion show towards the end where like they try to sabotage Fluttershy and Fluttershy agrees to it only for everyone to like it even more is another pretty funny moment as well. So on the whole, this is definitely a good episode, but I wouldn't call it a masterpiece. And I feel like it is sort of brought down by some minor stuff. And because of that, I have it here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8. And I feel like from this point on the list, the rest of these episodes are all pretty solid in my opinion. Although some of them are definitely better than others. And considering that it is season 1, I wouldn't call any of these like among the very, very best, but they're all solid in their own right. But at number 8, we have a pretty well regarded episode for me, and this is Sonic Rainboom. And again, this is a good episode. Now, admittedly, I wouldn't consider it one of my favorites, as I know a lot of people would. I know there was definitely a point where this was considered one of the best episodes in the entire series. I'm not entirely sold on that, but I think it's pretty good. Where obviously a lot of it centers around Rainbow Dash getting stage fright. I mean, some of that's stemming from like some childhood bullies sort of getting into her head to a degree, but it's also not helped by Rarity getting this magical spell that allows her to get wings to go around Cloudsdale, and through that she gets very egotistical as a result. And I'm sort of glad that they explained the fact that like the other ponies like were able to figure out a different spell that allowed them to walk on clouds that didn't involve that, and how it would have taken too long to give all of them wings. So I felt like that was pretty interesting how they were able to work that into the story. And also, of course, the gags with Fluttershy, like trying to cheer but struggling, is also pretty iconic as well. So again, this is a good episode and certainly good enough to be this high on the list. However, I wouldn't consider it one of my very favorites, so because of that, I have it here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another pretty solid episode, and I can see some people debating this one being a bit lower, but this is one that I definitely enjoy a bit more than most people, and here we have Call of the Cutie. And again, we have a CMC episode on here, and I know I talked about with earlier episodes on this list how one of the issues with season 1 is the fact that the CMC very much act like they are trying to get their own spin-off. And what other episode is there to talk about than this one, which was literally intended to be a backdoor pilot for the CMC to get their own show. And considering that, I felt like this episode was clearly the best CMC episode in season 1. I know I already talked about that in my previous video of mine, but I feel like a thing that really helps this episode is that it doesn't waste too much time with like the CMC antics that we come to see in Showstoppers and Stairmaster. Like a lot of it does focus on Apple Bloom, which you can definitely debate like why she gets all the focus, but I think at the end of the day it was the correct choice. I mean, she has a clear relationship to Applejack, and at this point in the series, like I mean, we've seen her in a couple episodes already. We haven't really gotten any focus from Sweetie Belle up to this point, as well as from Scootaloo. So I feel like it made sense for Apple Bloom to get the bulk of the focus here. And I like how a lot of it does focus on her, like trying to find her cutie mark. Now, I guess she has her friend Twist, who really only shows up in this episode as her friend, but once she gets her own cutie mark, she kind of distances herself. But I think a lot of this episode is pretty fun with her trying out different things, like her trying to get an Apple related cutie mark and her getting so excited when like her family members tell her about it, and she's like, apples, apples, apples. I don't know, that moment sticks out to me. There's obviously the moment where she's trying to sell apples and just keeps messing up and keeps making it more difficult until they decide to give up. Obviously, she tries different stuff, like with Rainbow Dash trying to work out, Pinky trying to make cupcakes only to fail, and of course we get to the Cutie era where we see Diamond Tiara like establish herself as an antagonist, or at least like a bit of a thorn in Apple Bloom's side, and then eventually meeting Scootaloo and Sweetie Belle. Mind you, that does come a bit out of nowhere, but considering this episode is from Apple Bloom's perspective, I'm not going to knock it too much. And then the resolution is pretty nice as well. So, admittedly, similar to Sonic Rainboom, it's not an overly amazing episode, but it is pretty solid in its own right, and a big reason that I have it here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another pretty good episode, arguably one that is more flawed than the last two we talked about, but one that I actually find myself enjoying more than the others, and one that I feel like has a bit more upside. And here we have Griffin the Brush Off. Now, I will say up front that arguably the biggest issue with this episode is that for a lot of it, Gilda doesn't seem the worst person in the world. Well, let me rephrase that. I mean, she's not that bad during the actual party, and it feels like a lot of it feels like she's just being egged on until she eventually snaps. However, even then, the episode does a good job at explaining it, saying that Rainbow Dash was the one to set off all of the traps, and that she was trying to have Gilda to have a good time, but because Gilda felt that Pinky was the one to set off the trap specifically to set her off, that's ultimately what did her in. And the fact that she gets so mad and admits that Pinky is annoying to her causes the fallout to happen between Rainbow and Gilda. So I don't feel like I faulted too much. I feel like it could have been handled a little better regardless, but it's still not the worst thing in the world. But if we're looking at the rest of the episode, I mean, it's pretty solid. I mean, right off the bat, I mean, one of the things that I really enjoy about it is the growing relationship between Pinky and Rainbow. I like the dynamic of Rainbow finding Pinky to be annoying and not really want to spend any time with her, even though Pinky very much does, and spends a lot of the early part of the episode trying to avoid her at all costs, only to eventually give in once Pinky won't stop looking for her. I found that to be a pretty interesting aspect of the relationship. And then, of course, them bonding over the course of the episode is pretty cool as well. Gilda entering the picture and, the Pinky trying to, make it like a 3-person thing, only for Gilda to exclude her at every opportunity without Rainbow really realizing it. Pinky spending a lot of the episode trying to show everyone that Gilda is a jerk, only for people like Twilight to say that maybe she's just jealous. And admittedly, that isn't the worst assumption to make in the world, given who she is, and the fact that we saw early in the episode that she was so desperate to appease Rainbow that it seems like a reasonable thing. We have the whole scene of Pinky watching Gilda do some bad stuff, culminating with her making Fluttershy cry. I mean, that's a pretty fun scene in its own. And of course, we have the climax where Pinky has the party trying to appease Gilda and then ultimately getting exposed. So on the whole, this is definitely a solid episode, and admittedly one that has more going on for it than some of the other ones I already talked about. However, I feel like the top 5 episodes definitely have more to offer and have fewer potential flaws in my opinion. So because of that, I'd leave it here at number 6. Alright, now we are inside the top 5, and at number 5 we have an episode that I have not talked about yet, even though I should have. And here we have the Cutie Mark Chronicles. Now I know I should have talked about this one in the CMC video, but I just completely forgot to include it. I mean, I don't know how it got lost in the shuffle or if I just considered it a main 6 episode instead, but in hindsight, I probably should have included it here, and now I get to talk about it, and this was a pretty fun episode. Now obviously we get some backstories for each of the main 6, thus explaining their characters, and they're pretty good for the most part, although I found Applejack's and Pinky's a bit rushed. It also benefits from being a relatively simple episode where the entire plot is the CMC trying to find Rainbow Dash so they can learn about her cutie mark, only for the rest of the main 6 being happy to help them out by sharing their own stories. And this gives the whole thing a very casual and relaxed feel. And it's pretty cool that the main 6 got their cutie marks at around the same time with the Rainboom. And aside from it being relevant in the Cutie remark, it's a pretty cool concept that as it kind of explains how these 6 are able to unlock the elements of harmony. It implies that their friendship was forged by destiny. And let's be real, the ending is pretty cute. So again, this is a pretty solid episode, and I feel like it's a pretty foundational one that makes a lot of future episodes really shine through and allows future episodes to be set up, which I'd give a lot of respect for when talking about this episode. Plus, it's pretty fun to watch in its own right. So because of that, I have it here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have another pretty good episode. One that I did debate a little bit, and I could see some people having this one a bit lower. But here at number 4, we do have Dragon Shy. And I feel like this, similar to Cutie Mark Chronicles, it's another pretty fun episode despite having some pretty high stakes along the way, where a lot of it does center around the main six trying to climb this mountain while helping Fluttershy along the way. So it feels like that. It also feels like Friendship is Magic Part 2, in my opinion, where despite the stakes being high, they're able to make it feel like a pretty simple adventure, which I don't mind at the end of the day. So there's that. Obviously, Fluttershy has a pretty interesting arc over the course of the episode where she's afraid to face the dragon, only to eventually stand up to the dragon once he's putting his friends into danger. So there's that. And again, I do have some minor complaints with this episode, namely the fact that the main six keep waffling back and forth between wanting to support Fluttershy, but also being annoyed by her setting them back. I feel like that is a minor issue with the episode, but considering the fact that Fluttershy is what carries this episode, plus there's plenty of fun moments along the way, it's a big reason I have this episode this high. But I feel like there are 3 episodes that are better than it, and because of that, I have it here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and I feel like this top 3 is pretty definitive for me, particularly with season 1 episodes. It's just a matter of the order. And at number 3, we definitely have the most flawed episode of the 3, but also the one that sticks to my mind the most. And here we have Party of One. And the fact that I haven't talked about this episode on my channel yet, considering 1, it's a Pinky episode, 2, it's a pretty important Pinky episode, and 3, just how fun I have watching it. It's sort of weird that I haven't brought it up yet, but now I have a chance to. Now I will get the big flaw out of the way is the fact that Pinky forgets her own birthday, which allows the plot to happen and explains a lot of her feelings during the episode. So I feel like that is a slight knock, the fact that she doesn't stop to think, oh, well, it's my birthday. Maybe they're just planning a surprise party for me. So that is a slight knock for me, but I feel like a lot of these episodes' greatness comes from Pinky's behavior to everything going on. There's the moment right after the first party where she's trying to get Twilight to stay, saying there's still some cake left. There's just a lot of sadness in her voice, and you can tell she doesn't want to be alone, and that parties are her way of fighting that loneliness. And there's her entire investigation of her friends as they avoid her, which are pretty funny. I mean, while reinforcing her quickness to assume they don't like her anymore. I think my favorite moment from all this is when Applejack tries lying, but because she's the element of honesty, she keeps struggling to lie, and then Pinky just stares her down over and over again, and that led to some pretty funny stuff. And of course, all this leads up to the Spike scene where she's scaring him and goading him to basically say what she wants to hear, only to get sad when he spits out those very words. And I felt like that was very interesting. You can tell she's very stuck in her head over all this, insecure about how deep her connections really are. On one hand, she throws parties to spend time with her friends and make them happy, but considering the fact that it is her cutie mark and her role within the main six dynamic, she internalizes the idea that she constantly needs to keep the act going to keep those friends around. And while she's generally a happy pony, a lot of that happiness comes from external validation rather than anything inside of her, which is an inherently unsustainable way of keeping her self-worth and happiness intact. So again, there is a lot going on in this episode. I guess you can fault the fact that a lot of this happens because she forgets her own birthday. But even then you can say that it sort of ties into her need to serve others that can cause her to forget about herself at times. And plus, this episode still manages to be a pretty fun ride on the whole with some funny moments while still revealing a lot about Pinky's character. However, it's that little knock of her forgetting her own birthday, which is a little silly, even with all this explanation I just gave, that leaves it outside the top 2. So because of that, I have it here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and a part of me was surprised that this episode ended up being above Party of One. However, I feel like it is a less flawed episode overall while being a bit of a more complete package. And here we have Suited for Success. And I feel like this is a pretty strong episode on the whole. I mean, with it being the first real focus episode for Rarity and the first one that really highlights her role as a producer of fashion, over a mere consumer of it, which I think is an interesting aspect to her character. The fact that she isn't just someone that goes to the mall and buys all these clothes. She is someone who is very entrenched within the industry and is someone that is actually trying to make a name for herself by making others feel beautiful in themselves. So I feel like that in itself makes this a pretty foundational episode as well. But I feel like the way the episode plays out as well is also pretty interesting, where she obviously wants to make all these dresses for her friends so that they'll look good at the Grand Calipin Gala, only for them to have these ridiculous visions that look very gaudy. And obviously, that leads to the fashion show where they show off all their ridiculous costumes and completely embarrasses not only themselves, but also Rarity in the process. We have the entire sequence of Rarity after this, like her just completely shutting herself off and just going full on wanks during this moment, with her getting really over the top, like her like being both very sad genuinely, but also someone that really wants to get stuck in the idea of being this woeful person. Like she literally stops in the middle of her grieving to be like, oh, I need to lay on this couch, or I need to eat this flavor of ice cream, or I need to go to this specific place to run away to. So even within her breakdown, there's plenty of funny moments within that. This is also the episode where Rainbow Dash says it's 20% cooler, which, despite this being the only time she ever actually says it, it ends up being her catchphrase outside the show, which is something at least. I mean, the song's pretty solid, like with her really breaking down her creative process, but the friends getting in the way. And of course, there's the ending where they allow her to use her knowledge of what's good fashion to channel the friends' wants and interests into something that will appeal not only them, but also the general public. And through that, like she comes out like feeling pretty good about herself, and people start to recognize her talent for what it is. And I felt like that was a pretty solid message in its own right. Sort of this idea that, yes, while she's there to make others beautiful and to fulfill their desires, that like she also has some knowledge about how to do that without making that things too embarrassing. So I felt like that was a pretty unique message in its own right. And plus, this episode just has a lot going for it, with obviously establishing Rarity as someone that wants to create, someone that wants to serve others, but also someone who can get a bit of a drama queen and a bit over the top at points. So I felt like that all led to a very interesting episode in its own right, plus a song, as I mentioned earlier. So, like I said, this is a very complete episode for me. However, I feel like there's one other episode that really tops it out. So, because of that, I had to leave it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the best episode of season 1 for me is the finale to season 1. We have The Best Night Ever. And admittedly, I wasn't expecting this to be number 1 coming into the list. I thought Party of One, or possibly Suited for Success, might have taken it. But the more I thought about it, I just felt like this was a very complete episode for me, where it has 6 storylines going on all at the same time. We see each of the main 6 like come into the gala with very set expectations, very unique expectations over what to get out of it. And just to see all of them come up short in very interesting ways is a big sort of intrigue for this episode. Also, the song at the beginning is also very strong for me, especially someone that enjoys Stephen Sondheim. So I felt that was pretty interesting. You know, there are some questions about Prince Blue Blood and how he fits into the royal family, but seeing all of his interactions were pretty funny. Just him like completely using Rarity while being a complete slob in his own right. And of course, Rarity's breakdown at the end, snapping at him, is pretty funny in its own right. There's also Fluttershy, her storyline of trying to get along with all the animals, but just not being able to connect with them. And of course, leading up to the line, you are going to love me. And even Pinky like has a good storyline as well, with like her trying to turn this into an actual party, only for it to not really be her jam. And then over the course of the evening, really spice things up to the point where all the main 6 like are able to like make it on their own. And the fact that Celestia buys into all this, saying that, oh, the gala is always boring, so like I'm so glad I invited you so that you can make it interesting. Just sort of that element as well made it pretty cool. So like I said, this episode does a good job of making this feel like an event. I feel pretty similarly about this episode with regards to Twilight's Kingdom, where I mean, this episode isn't as good as Twilight's Kingdom, but it has a very similar effect of making it feel like this big culmination of storylines that's been taking place over the course of the season, while being pretty jam packed in its own right, making it feel like a very complete event, despite it only being a 22-minute episode. So I feel like I got to give a lot of respect for that. And it's a big reason that I have this episode here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. And as I said at the beginning of the video, this is part of a bigger project that I'm doing where eventually I want to rank every single episode of MLP Friendship is Magic. And this was a very important first step in that, in ranking all the season 1 episodes. But moving forward, of course, I'm going to make several videos for the season 2 episodes and moving down the line for all 9 seasons of the show. And then after that is all done, I'm going to combine all those lists into one massive ranking. That's probably going to take forever anyway. I might make it into separate videos. I haven't entirely decided how I want to approach it yet, but it is a very exciting project for me. Really one of the biggest projects that I was looking forward to when starting this channel, and really bringing this all to life. I mean, MLP is a show that I care about a lot, and I know that these videos don't do as well view-wise as, say, the Total Trauma videos, but it's still a show that I enjoy covering, and something that I really want to cover and talk about episodes that I haven't gotten a chance to talk about yet. So stay tuned for all that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.